So, welcome to Walpole United WFC.
Hi guys, Natalie here. Wednesday night show, big show. Got Catherine, who writes for Since 71, writes about Australian football, writes about all kind of football. And obviously Connor, who everyone knows, who I've been talking to a lot. So I just thought, it'd be good to have a. I hope you don't mind me saying this, kind of a new fan's perspective, because I suppose I've been in it for a while. Catherine's probably been in it longer, so it's good to have a fresh, someone who's just started watching this year. What do they think about these proposals? So yeah, guys, get in the comments, like, share, subscribe. You know what to do. Guys, Catherine, how are you doing?
I'm good.
Good.
A bit tired. I write for football in the women's game in Australia, so I'm on Australia time. So I only had a few hours of sleep after working yesterday. But yeah, I'm tired. Good.
Oh, good. Hi, I think that's Marty. If it's not, let me know. Hi. Connor, how are you doing?
Yeah, it's not bad. I'm not doing it as anything as exciting as what Catherine's just said there, but yes, I'm all good.
No, you're just as important, don't worry. I just want to get into it then. Obviously, I'm sure more people come through. They'll tell us what they think, but obviously I've been really reading it, seeing it more. Jill Ellis came out and said it's not a foregone conclusion. A lot of people feeling like it is something that FIFA put forward. I saw Alex Morgan today sort of talking about there's pros and then there's the cons. But as a fan, I can only see cons. I can only see it being detrimental to the club game. I see what Alex Morgan sort of said about more people watch the World Cup, so it's better. But, I think we see with 2019 World Cup, there was a big boost in attendances at the in the WSL, and then now we're sort of back where we were. So it's like we had all these big massive attendances, people wanted to watch, and now we're back where we are. And you can sell out Wembley, but where are the people when it comes week in, week out? I don't think the two, I get where she's coming from, but the two don't align. It's only a small percentage of football that you watch. Go on.
Like the reality is that in the States, it hasn't actually come through that way. Like they had the 1999 World Cup, and they had the World Cups in the 2000. They rehosted the World Cup in 2003, the United States, that is, which was a lot smaller because they kind of took it over at the last minute because of the SARS epidemic, and then it went to China, and then there was 2011. But when you look at the history in the US, yes, they've always made it really far, and there's a bit of a boost, but it's never been enough of a boost to really make those leagues back home actually take off. Case in point, they've lost 2 leagues out of the 3 professional ones that they've tried to set up. And the current one that is in place, the NWSL, has largely grown out of the labor of its least paid players. Like 75% of which make less than $30,000 American a year, which I think in pounds is like 22,000 pounds. In a lot of the markets they play, that's not a living wage. So yeah, it gives visibility, but who does it give visibility to? And I would argue the average football player only sees a really small bonus, and it's only in some countries that have gone far in the tournament that you see that. Elsewhere, it's a momentary blip. What we need to do is make our domestic competition stronger if we truly care about all women, not just the 32 nations who might play at the next cup.
100%. Do you feel when you're seeing this, and Marty's saying here it's not sustainable, and I know we had a little conversation off air, but when it's all coming out and you're seeing it and you're thinking, what's going on here? Who has decided this? And I know you're Canadian, Catherine, but it feels like it is a push from the American. It does feel, and maybe that's not right, but it does feel, Jill Ellis. Then now I've heard Alex Morgan. I've heard Infantino from UEFA say it's a good thing. Obviously, that's probably more on the men's side, but then we all know what they think of, not in a horrible way. What do you think, Connor, then?
What?
Coming in and hearing that.
Well, just quickly on what my points I've written down. Obviously, I've briefly read what Morgan said and what she's saying about what it could do for the leagues. Me personally, if you want to try and grow the game, you've got to start from the bottom up, build the grassroots up first, especially in England. Focus on tier 5, 4, 3 and the championship. Get more teams into them. Build the WSL to 20 teams or 18 at least, so it's kind of alongside the Premier League. And start from the ground up. Because a lot of yes, the viewing figures for a World Cup will be bigger because it's a national tournament or whatever. But those fans are not necessarily going to transfer then to supporting their local team. Because let's say in the men's, for example, like if you're a Leicester fan, you'll go support Leicester and support England. Obviously, I know they've just come up to the WSL, they're now promoted, but there's other teams around the country, let's say Stoke, for example, where their women's team, obviously, I don't even know if they've got a women's team. If they are, they're not, are they tier 4, 3 maybe?
Yeah.
So you're looking at those, start from, that's all I think I'd say, is just start from the ground up, build the grassroots and the foundations first, because it's great, the viewing numbers, but you've got to get people into stadiums and you've got to get players from the ground up.
If I can say something, like, as a Canadian, we are the country of example that a World Cup does nothing for your grassroots. Like, we hosted a World Cup here in 2015. I think I went to 13 games during that tournament, and we don't have a single professional team in Canada. We don't even have like an amateur domestic competition that's truly Canadian after having actually hosted a World Cup. So like the idea that somehow World Cups will help football, I agree with Connor. Like, it doesn't, it might help a select number of people, but it doesn't necessarily help the average female footballer who is playing at the elite level. It doesn't even, in our situation, ensure that you're actually going to get an elite level.
Yeah, and also as well, just on, quickly on the back of that as well.
Go for
because
it.
all of those players at the different nations will go back to their respective leagues. Some might be in America, Australia, around Europe. It doesn't help the quality, let's say, of the league. The one thing I've noticed with the WSL this year is it's a bit more competitive, so it's better to watch, because at the end of the day, football's entertainment. So you want people like we see in the Premier League, teams can kind of beat everyone. In the WSL, it's getting a bit more like that. Obviously, in previous years, it's just been, I think I've said on another show, Chelsea, Arsenal, City. You know they're going to beat the rest, and then those two will play each other. This season, it's a bit more closer. It's still kind of Chelsea, Arsenal, kind of at the top, but I think that's what I mean. Like, yes, it's great for these individual players at the top of the level, but if you start building from the ground up, improve players in the championship, there's some teams actually in the championship that probably could go into the WSL, but that's another conversation. But improve the teams in tier 5, 4, and 3, and then you start growing the league. It becomes more competitive, and then you do start get more people watching. You get better quality players in the championship and tier 3 and whatever. So I don't agree with this kind of argument that yes, it's great viewing numbers, but like I said, you need people in stadiums and you need competitiveness at the top level. Like we see in the Champions League at the minute, you know roughly who's going through at least to the last 4. You want a few more teams in there, make it more competitive, more people will watch, more people will follow, and younger girls will start looking at going, oh, there's a route in there. That's just what I think on it. I just think just improve from the bottom up.
Well, definitely want to touch on a few points. Catherine, you sort of said about Canada, and they hosted a World Cup, and then they've just won the gold medal, and we're sitting here sort of, and they're still sort of talking about when is the Canadian League going to start, or when is there going to be a Canadian team in NWSL potentially, and I know there's little chats about it, but how is this 2-year World Cup? I don't see how that would help. And I'm seeing Rain just saying here about the Euros, and that's something that's coming to England, and I think that's going to be a massive boost for our league, seeing those players, people are able to get to it. But, you know,
like, I think one of the things that we keep that is being dropped in this conversation is, like, if you have another World Cup, so you're adding it every 2 years, you're going to have to drop a tournament at some point, or there will be tournaments that will become secondary. And the Confederation tournaments seem to be the ones that are primed to kind of be reduced in importance. But realistically, those are the tournaments we should be pushing more, not less. Because if we look at who's actually qualified for World Cups, since 1991, when the first Women's World Cup was held, there have only been 36 different nations who have qualified. You know, Granted, there's only been 2 tournaments. It's only been since Canada that it was 24 nations that were able to qualify. And the next one, there'll be 32 nations in Australia. But it's a really, really small group that have actually been able to make it to the top level. And so you only have 36 nations who showed up. And what it's done for a lot of those nations is it's reinforced their dominance at the top, almost ensuring that they will return. So if we look at the UEFA qualification right now, realistically, in every single table or every single group, we almost know who's going to win that group, or there's a realistic expectation that the top pot team will win that group, will progress to the World Cup, and then the real battle will be in those number 2 positions that might also have places up for grabs. It's really rare that we see new teams break through. So the best way to actually expand is through these confederations. And there's confederations that are barely competitive at all, or who've just started their competitive iteration. So if we take CONMEBOL, like when Argentina, the men's side, was number 1 in the world, its women's side in 2017 wasn't even listed because they didn't play enough. They hadn't played in I think 2 years. CONMEBOL is just starting to gain an upswing where its teams are able to play in local competitions and from there gain experience to be competitive at the world level. If you're doing a World Cup every 2 years, are you going to allow CONMEBOL? Are you going to allow CONCACAF that just introduced 2 tournaments? Before, it was literally a 17-day tournament to qualify for the World Cup and a 17-day tournament to qualify for the Olympics. That was the only competition we had in this confederation. Like you're just going to reinforce those teams that are at the top if you don't make the structure underneath competitive. Exactly what Connor was talking about when it comes to domestic football. I don't know if you guys agree.
I think, no, 100%, because I think even you see with the Premier League, if you put all the money and all the top teams get the money, then obviously the top teams are going to succeed. You talked about Argentina. That was the first time I'd seen them play was the 2019 World Cup. I'm not sure if they made one previous. I'm not that clued up, but I know Jamaica, the first time, my other nation that I support, and I see they're bringing through players in WSL that probably don't get chance in England. Seeing Paige Bailey-Gale, I don't even know, Dawn Spence, Rebecca, the Spurs keeper, I got her name avoids me, but Becky Spence, world class. She's done really well at the start. Kept City out, kept only conceded 1 goal against City, and she's playing in Jamaica, and they're getting regular tournaments now. Like you said, the confederations are playing more often, and it's better for Jamaica to then attract, say, a mixed race female from England, that kind of thing. And you're seeing them grow as a nation, getting better. Bunny Shaw playing at City, you're seeing that, and I just think what Connor even said about adding more teams in WSL, it'll make it all better for everyone.
What I fear is so if you take Jamaica's case, Jamaica was able to qualify for the World Cup largely because we've gone over this. I'm terrible with first names, with names in general. Bob Marley's daughter, and I hate referring to people but Bob Marley's daughter largely did a funding campaign to make it to the World Cup. And even there, they were struggling at the end to actually get the funding to be able to get to actually be able to pay players to go and do the World Cup games, like the one they did at Hampton Park against Scotland, to go elsewhere, just to be able to actually make it. So when you qualify for a World Cup, your expenses, my understanding, are covered when you get there. And FIFA kind of, but up to getting there, they're not necessarily covered. So Jamaica got exposure through that World Cup. But if they don't have other competitions to play for, if they can only get partial funding, and we know that what you win in the women's tournaments is a lot less than what the men win. It is a fraction, and arguably probably doesn't help cover the costs. Is a World Cup every 2 years actually sustainable for them? Because I forget her name, Bob Marley's daughter is not always going to be there to help them like fundraise their way to a World Cup every 2 years. We have to find a way to make. What's her name? Cedela, that's it.
Cedela Marley.
Yeah. Like, and I would argue that this is the main problem for most women's teams, is that they are chronically underfunded at the national team level. So again, I'm going back to my thing, like a World Cup every 2 years. Yeah, it might give more exposure, but will it just reinforce the teams that are already wealthy enough and have already kind of like cemented their place at the top of the pyramid and exclude other ones who are now possibly missing opportunities with confederation tournaments that could actually allow their teams to grow?
Connor, I want to bring you in there, mate, because obviously we're, new to women's football. It's you only just started watching. I think you started learning. I think you probably know more, just as much as me now. But like, what do you think? Because it's something that is big in the men's game in a way, in terms of just money. And now, for me, that's just what it feels like. It feels like a money grab, a power grab. So what do you think, mate, when you hear about it and people pushing it?
I think it's exactly that, and I'm a living proof that it doesn't translate into fans going to grounds. I know United didn't have a team back then, but I watched the World Cup in, I think it was 2015. I think that was the Canada one, actually, where England got to the semi-final. I think it was the Laura Bassett own goal, actually, against Japan. I think it was in that semi-final. And I remember I watched every game in that tournament, but I didn't then follow it on, because ultimately I watched England for a bit. I don't particularly care about internationals, but at the time I was like, right, okay, watching them, whatever. But that didn't translate, same as a few years ago. It's only speaking to you and John and other people that I've got involved in Man United women. So I'm living proof that it doesn't always translate to actual fans in grounds. And I'm pretty sure that's the same for a lot of people. Because I said people then, or not people, players then disperse back to their countries, wherever they play for, or the clubs they play for. So it doesn't always translate. But it's exactly what you said there. It's money. And I feel like the one thing I've noticed just following women's football recently, it almost feels like the women's game gets dragged along with whatever the men want to do in some respects. I think they decide something and go, right, it was exactly the same when the Super League proposals happened earlier in the year. It's like, the women's league will follow suit. Like, there was no real discussion about it. And I feel like it's kind of the same. They're just like, yeah, they'll follow suit. So I don't like it from a personal reason, because I don't really like internationals, but also it just doesn't make sense, because I mean, just look at the men's game, for example. Obviously, the women's game is obviously aiming to grow to that level. You've got 4 tournaments in England in the men's. You've got the Club World Cup, the Nations League got brought in, the Euros, the Champions League, Europa League, Conference League now, the Olympics, the Copa America. Now they're looking at 2 World Cups. That's far too many games for players to be playing in. And if the women's game wants to grow, I'm going to repeat this again, it needs to start from the ground up. I think that's what we all kind of agree on, that you can't just throw World Cups and big names and big tournaments and go, that's going to grow it, because it doesn't. I'm living proof that it doesn't, because just because you watch one tournament on TV, that doesn't translate to then going down to your local club, let's say tier 4, tier 3, whatever it is in England. It doesn't always translate to that. You need to work on those bases first before you just start chucking tournaments at people.
I would say it does translate in some situations, but I would say I absolutely agree. You have to work from the ground up, and I would say you have to work from the ground up both domestically and internationally, because I'm going to keep harping on this. Only 36 nations have made it to a World Cup when it comes to women. It's a really small select group. So those 140, I think, odd nations that are 110 odd nations that might also like be entered into that mix don't necessarily get the same visibility, but they should have this, because as much as leagues are important, did I lose you both? Okay, as much as domestic leagues are important, in a lot of places around the world, the best way to get girls into football is to get acceptance. It is still a huge barrier for significant parts around the world. And one of the places that we've seen acceptance is when national teams actually get some visibility. So you have to find ways of actually boosting the national team to say, look, you can play for your nation. It is as much of an honor for girls. And then that in turn helps the domestic. But you can't pin it on a World Cup. Like that's not, again, 36 nations have made it. Like it's a very small select group. We have to find a way to make it democratic. Sorry.
No, I was just going to quickly ask, does anyone here think that it almost, having the World Cup, this translates to men's and women, does anyone feel like it almost belittles the tournament a bit, having it 2 years?
Yes,
there's something quite
absolutely.
special about having it 4 years. I feel like it just takes away a little bit if it's every 2.
100%, because... Well,
no, you go.
No, I'm just going to say 100% because I don't want to see it every 2 years. I love the Euros. The Euros was an amazing thing, and that comes around every 2 years as well. And, you know, I hear Rain here sort of saying about Northern Ireland. They're pushing. They're doing really well. They're winning qualifying games. They're up there, and, you know, he's sort of worried about their competitiveness. They're just announced that they're going to be a full-time team. And, you know, teams like Northern Ireland are growing, Republic of Ireland are growing, getting better, winning more games. And I think we're seeing a competitiveness in Europe now. I think, you know, there's a few teams. I know you said about pot one. Pot one is pot one, but in pot two, Sweden, Norway, Spain, these are teams that could then go on and win the Euros still, I think, this year coming into the Euros for, obviously, the Women's Euros this year. And, you know, they play great football. And I think if we, like we said about lack of Confederate games, if we don't see them, then we're going to, you know, lose this competitiveness that we are seeing and a growth in international football. I
mean, like what I was going to say is to add a Canadian, like kind of side perspective. We have like our biggest sport here is hockey, ice hockey for men's. Women's, there's no professional. But when it comes to the men's, they have the equivalent of a world championship, and it takes place every year. It generally takes place after the NHL season has finished the regular season, while the kind of the playoffs of the Stanley Cup is going on. And I'm going to be honest, like sometimes you'll get good games and people will talk about those good games, but nobody really cares that much about Canada winning that world championship because it takes place every single year. What we care about is the Olympics because it is exclusive. It is every 4 years. It is really difficult to win. You know, it is in a way special. And if you put it every 2 years does in a certain way remove kind of the allure. I'm almost afraid that people will get like international football or World Cup fatigue, and it will in fact backfire because they're just so like, they just played 2 years ago. Like, do we really care about it again?
Yeah, I the reason I asked that question is because we're seeing it. I'm a big rugby union fan, and we're kind of seeing it in that sport as well, because the Six Nations is every single year. Now, it's the same 6 teams, same format every single year, and it's usually really... I mean, that France are now kind of getting involved as well. So it's about 3 teams that can win it. You know, Italy are going to come bottom. You know, Scotland are going to be kind of 5th or 4th. And it's going to be England, France, and Wales that are kind of in the top 3. And some fans that I speak to now are kind of getting... Their only focus is the World Cup. Now, that's every 4 years. So there's that big hype around it. And if there's a big build-up to get there... Whereas the Six Nations, like, right, okay, want to win it, but it's every year, so it's not a big thing. It's like you just said there about the Olympics. That's the big thing you look forward to. There's more hype around it, and it generates more people because everyone just can't wait for that tournament, I feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, but even like if we compare to rugby union, sorry, you were talking on the men's side when you were talking about like Wales, England, and yes, France. Yeah. But if we look at the women's Six Nations, like Ireland actually won it in 2014, and then they hosted a World Cup at home, and they've since just gone completely downhill, their women's program, to the point that last month they didn't even qualify for the next World Cup. Like, having tournaments more often doesn't necessarily translate to federations backing women's programs if they don't see it as a priority, or if they don't understand how to do it. Does that make any sense? Like, we've seen this happen in other sports.
Yeah, I fully agree. And it's the one thing I do agree with international. Like I just said, I'm not a huge international fan, but the one thing I do agree with what you said earlier about exposure, and then it makes that, let's say, that nation put more money into that sport for that, let's say, for the women's side. We've seen it with England women, obviously the growth of that, and now obviously we've seen what's happening in the WSL with Sky and BBC pushing it a bit more, and that is probably because of England women and the way that they are. But if you're a team has got to start from somewhere, a nation has got to start from somewhere. So unless you have that kind of financial backing, and this is where FIFA need to start looking at these things and looking at nations that are not going to challenge, because not every team is going to be able to challenge in the Euros and the World Cup and so on. So you're going to need that financial backing first before you start looking at those things. So I do agree, and we've seen it in the Olympics. You see random sports pop up, like handball, like 10 years ago that was a new sport or whatever. Now there's handball centres, one 15 minutes away from me. You see these centres popping up. So that is a way that sport is going to grow, especially on the women's game. But I feel like they just need to look at like you said, they're the smaller nations that are not going to challenge, because nobody wants to see necessarily a losing team every, let's say, 4 years. But I just feel like FIFA needs to start looking at those nations as well, because it's great if you've got a brilliant team and everything's great. Let's say England, hoping to challenge every year. But if you're a nation that is not necessarily challenging, and you're not going to challenge, so I don't know, it might just put some people off going, well, we know we're not going to compete this year and things like that. So
that was my original point of the US during the noughties. Like, they weren't, like, they still did well. They got to like to semifinals, and to like, they won the gold medal in 2007 for football, the women's team, that is. But it didn't translate into the domestic game or domestic club competitions actually growing. Like, there's not necessarily a direct correlation. You have to have a strategic plan to actually make that happen. I would say the other thing is, like, if we compare it to rugby union, so like rugby union has this really exclusive club of a number of nations that sit on top and then nations that are below. And I'd argue there's players that probably have never gotten their worth in the sport because they don't happen to come from a nation that is like a top tier nation. They don't have a passport for that nation, so they don't get the same exposure. And arguably we have that in football, especially in women's football. Like, take Katie McCabe, great player, or Jess Fishlock, great players, but they play for nations that have yet to actually qualify for a major tournament. So they are staking the entirety of actually Jordan Nobbs probably also falls into this. Like, their entire career is at the club side where there's a lot less exposure. Yet I think they deserve as much praise as an Alex Morgan, but they won't get it because that exposure is just so minimal still. And if you go to a World Cup every 2 years, you're just going to continue that miniature exposure. And you might exclude players who are fantastic, but who just don't come from nations who are competitive.
Yeah, 100%. 10 people watching, guys. Hit the like button. Get subscribing. The more people subscribe, the better content we can get in. But here's a question from Jockey, and it's made me think. I'm like Connor a bit. I'm not mad for international football. If we could do away with it, I would. Especially the number of breaks that we have and the length. But we'll get onto that as well. But I do agree with him in this sense. They should build more tournaments like the She Believes. And maybe the She Believes was a lot of travelling. But we are seeing now there's going to be a tournament in England. I think we even seen with the Archive Cup. There's going to be a tournament in England, and I think they're playing France and they're playing Spain, or I can't remember who exactly they're playing. But it's like sort of Holland, England, France, and another, and it's going to be a big tournament. It's going to be big national teams playing each other. And like we said about building building continental football, do you think we'll see more of that? Do you think we need to see more of like She Believes, or actually competitive matches rather than sort of uncompetitive?
Yes and no. Like, I wish we could see a strengthening of the confederation competitions, which I think is the place that we should really be focusing at the moment. Because like the She Believes, they invite nations in the top 10. You know, even the tournament that was held in France, like it was all nations in the top 15 in the world. Like, unless you can actually start getting these miniature tournaments where you have teams who aren't in the top 20 in the world who can start showing up, and there can be a backing and there can be fans and it can be on television. Like, these miniature competitions once again reinforce the dominance of those who are already at the top. Like, you know, so they're great. And they, especially like, you know, CONCACAF, like I said, we had 32 days every 4 years of CONCACAF like competitions total. It's not at all in any way like UEFA's system. But yeah, so for some confederations it could help. But if you're inviting UEFA teams and if you're not inviting teams from your own confederation to strengthen it, I think there's a limit to how much they are impactful. And like in the last couple of years, I would argue that the She Believes is more of a traveling roadshow and an entertainment thing than a true competition. Like, we have to find more areas of true competition where we can raise more nations, not reinforce those at the top.
No, I agree. Connor, what do you think? I know you might not have known about the She Believes, or you might have semi-heard of it, or hear of like competitions, like friendly tournaments, let's say, during the early January time. And I think England are not going to travel for it, but they're going to do their own little one, like Spain, Germany. I can't even remember who's in it. But, I mean, what do you think of those kind of friendly tournaments that they have? I suppose like a Nations League, but
I was just about to say that. Yeah, it's similar to. It sounds very similar to the Nation League, but I agree with what Catherine was just saying. It's just going to be the same teams at the top again. You want to build other teams up, because, contrary to what I was just saying earlier about belittling the World Cup, if it's every 2 years, it almost makes those kind of bigger tournaments irrelevant if it's just the same teams at the top every time. You want new teams. The only excitement I get from international football is when you see newer teams, like we saw Costa Rica in the men's a few years ago. You see smaller teams coming up because they've built over a few years. They get to a big tournament and then they can shock people when they get there. If you see the same, let's say, 6 teams over and over and over, it's great for those 6 nations. It's great for those. The money will keep coming in. They'll keep winning things. But for these smaller nations that are not, it's like I said earlier, you don't want to keep going and seeing the losing side. You want that the whole brilliance of football is that hope and optimism. You go to a game thinking you can beat anybody. But if you're not getting a chance to build, then you're not going to have that kind of optimism in bigger tournaments, and let's say the Euros and the World Cup. So I kind of like I'm not a fan of the Nations League in the men's because it's just another tournament that's just irrelevant. But I can kind of see why. It's almost like the Six Nations, actually, in the rugby, what this She Believes sounds like, where you have kind of 7 or 8 teams. They all play each other in almost like a mini league. And you kind of get a winner out of it. I mean, how often is it? Is it every year, by the sounds of it?
It's every year. So the women have like an international window in March where they're allowed to play 3 games. Most confederations are allowed to play 3 games. So they play like a group stage, essentially.
So, I mean, it's better than friendlies because nothing is worse to me than international friendlies because I just think they're so pointless, especially when we saw them over the last 12 months during a COVID year. It was just, I can't believe we even did that, but that's another story. But yeah, so anything that replaces friendlies, I'm all for. But like I said at the start, I'm a big lover of club football, and I'd rather we see our own leagues, and we see leagues in Spain and Italy, like obviously Europe and all across, you know, like you just mentioned there about the confederations in Africa, South America. Let's build those leagues up. Let's get, you know, those to a higher standard as well, not just focus on the top teams, I think.
Yeah, jockeys, agreeing with you. Club team should come before country. What do you think, Catherine, to that? Do you think, or do you think it should be equal, or? Don't worry.
So, like, one thing that we do have to discuss, like, why I do think that more opportunities, especially for women to play internationally, is important, is that, like, there are very few nations where you can make a living off club football, you know? So, again, I'm going to harp back to Canada. But also, like, Australia, I would argue, is in the same boat because they only have 12 games, regular season games in the A-League women. You know, so the rest of the year, those women are either doing other jobs or going overseas to play. So, but to go overseas to play, if you're Canadian or if you're Australian or if you're from any nation that if you're not part of the Schengen, like you need to have a work visa. And if you look, for example, at how the WSL has its work visa set up, you need to have a certain number of appearances in your competition. And remember, there's a lot of nations that don't have domestic competitions, or if they have domestic competitions, they're really, really limited. And you need to have a certain number of appearances internationally. So where it's important to make sure that women actually play regularly is to give those players that might be part of nations that don't necessarily make it to the World Cup, but whom themselves have the capability of competing and being professionals, the chance to actually get the visa points to get to those nations where they can make a living out of it. Does that make any sense? Because if not, so. You know, we keep talking about like the men's side. They keep harping on like, oh, this is European focus. This is European focus. Well, you know what? At the moment, the only nation that you can really make a living if you're a woman the only places really are European nations. Like there are very limited visa places in the NWSL. And like I said, the A-League women is not full-time. And even the new WE League in Japan has a very limited number of spaces. Anyway, that's mine.
No, I agree with you, because I think we even saw with Leicester's sort of signing, it took a while. Don't know how I think they ended up appealing, but she was from Slovenia and she played in the Slovenian league. I think they played like a qualifying game of Champions League that probably boosted her, but she was the under-19 captain, and I know they've ended up changing the rules or whether they've changed it, but she was, had played international football throughout the age group. So I do think international football is important. We're never going to do away with it fully, but something Namrata is sort of saying here, it's just a break to recover for the disappointments around United. No, but it's not even the disappointment. I know a lot of people were disappointed about the derby, but the way I look at it, and Connor, I definitely want to hear your point, because it's frustrating. Manchester United 2-2, that game, I'm going to say 4K attended, even though it was 3.9 or whatever. 4K, 4,000 people got down to Lee, watched it. It was, the drama of it, the energy in the crowd. And now you're waiting 3-4 weeks.
I'm just going to give one fan a shout out, and that's you, Natalie, because I love that game. I watched it all the way in Canada with my father, and I swear I heard you at one point, and my dad picked you out in the crowd 2 times. He's like, hey, there's your
podcast for her. There's your friend. She's in England. Yeah. But that's the thing, though. It was so good. It was so, I've seen the pictures of the crowd, and when they celebrated when Russo scored, and we're going to have to wait a month, basically. A month to see your team play again. And even then, it's not even at home, it's away. And then when's the next home game, Connor? God knows. Only God knows.
Well, that's what we said when we left Durham last Thursday. We were like, oh my God, there's not a game for United for 4 weeks. That game's then we got 2 back-to-back aways. Then our next home game is late November. We played City 2 weeks ago. So it's over a month between our 2 home games. And I saw a comment earlier about it's good for the players to rest. I think somebody made the point. I think in the women's game, maybe yes. In the men's, no, because all internationals is doing in the men's game. And I made this point earlier that FIFA just dragged the women's football federation along. I think whatever they decide, they don't even consider what women's football want. They just go, you're doing it. But I don't agree that it's good for rest. In the men's game, it's actually making it worse. Ilkay Gundogan, obviously plays for Man City, came out in the summer when all these proposals were coming out saying, does anyone actually think of the players? Because all it's doing, in the men's game, like I said earlier, you've got about 15 tournaments you're playing. We saw last year that they don't care. FIFA don't care about the players, in all seriousness. They don't, because they're putting games look at how it was after COVID. They could have quite easily moved things back. No, they had to get the international friendlies in. They had to get all the qualifiers in. Then the Euros, Premier League started a bit earlier, 2 games a week. The World Cup next year for the men's is in Qatar, which is midway through a Premier League season. So you've got Premier League, then you've got a World Cup, the rest of the Premier League crammed in, the Olympics, the Euro. Like, players are not getting a rest. Certainly in the men's, I do agree. In the women's, there's less games, so I get that. But
I would say that counterbalances with the fact that women's squads are a lot smaller than men's squads, and in most situations, they don't have a reserve team to actually draw from. Like, like Gareth Thomas, the Man City coach. Like he isn't pulling from his academy team because he says they aren't at the top. So like, yes, women play less games overall, but there's less players within each squad to actually play those games.
Yeah, but I'd
like to see the league,
isn't it? It's like we said earlier, isn't it, about the league expanding, and then you have to, because the only way players are going to grow is by game time. So the only way, I completely disagree when Gareth Taylor said that. As a new fan, anyway, he should be using some of these academy players. Just stick him on the bench. What's that going to do? It's good for those girls to get that experience in the matchday squad. But if you play more, if you have more teams in the league, and this is what I said earlier, let's say you grab 6 teams in the championship now, put them into WSL, 18 teams, then you play more, you have more rotation. Younger girls get better at game because they're getting more game experience, they're playing better chance at representing their national teams then. And then you start seeing it grow if you're playing more games. At the moment, because there's, like you just said, there's so little games, the squads are so small, you can almost pick the 11 bar maybe 1 or 2 rotations for, let's say, from a United point of view. So there's not really a chance. There's not really a pathway because, like you said, because the games are so limited. And that's the one thing I've noticed that is good, like you said there about internationals, is it gives some of these younger players coming through a chance at playing. Obviously we've got the under-19s tournament and all these other kind of things. So like I said, I speak quite negatively of internationals, but the one good thing is it does give some of these younger players a chance because there isn't that rotation, certainly in the WSL at the moment.
Yeah, I don't think Marty likes Gareth Taylor. I don't think a lot of people liked him after those comments. And then Marta's just put a comment about her national team. I hope she don't mind me speaking, but I think she's from India. So their national, well, no, I know she's from India. So they don't play much. She don't get excited. Well, but go on. Her club's United.
Yeah, I was going to say, like the other thing that, like, more international games, again, I kind of harped on it earlier, like, can national associations actually afford to have international games for those players? Or are they even prioritizing more international games for female players? And also, like, if you have more international games, are they actually giving wage subsidies or pay allowances to those players who go away? Because, like, this is something that isn't talked about a lot, but if you're not getting wage replacements and you're away with your national team for 2 months, like, I don't know how many people can do that in the long run. And this is still very common in the women's game, like female players literally having to make huge financial sacrifices to represent their country. So if you're adding that on and you're not ensuring that women have an adequate, like, living situation because of this, like, that's not going to help in the long run either. But there might be national associations who just can't afford to actually have more international games. Especially if their men's team didn't do well and didn't qualify for tournaments, and in turn they don't have any money in the national association to actually support it anyway.
Yeah, but that's where FIFA, isn't it, need to step in and start trying. If they really want to grow it like they say they do, that's where they need to step in. Not just, I've repeated it again, like when they said, I really do feel like they just dragged the women's game along with whatever the men's do. I found it disgraceful earlier in the year when we had all these Super League proposals, and they pretty much just said the women's league will follow suit. No, they won't. They've got their own rights, and they'll do at least have a conversation about it. So that's what I mean. FIFA needs to step in and help some of these smaller. Otherwise, it's never going to grow. Because, like you said, if the men's team isn't growing as well, how are they ever going to be able to compete and grow if they don't have some kind of fund? Money doesn't just appear. It's got to come from somewhere.
Well, Rhea Percival, who plays for New Zealand, did an interview last year where she kind of outlined it really well. And when she was talking about, the question was kind of related around prize money. And her point was, like, because New Zealand is so far and it's a really expensive confederation to kind of operate in, they're so dependent on how the All Whites, which is the men's team, perform, because if they don't get the money that might come from FIFA, the women's team, like even like the women's team basically go to every Olympics and every World Cup because they always qualify through the OFC. But there's not enough coming through to FIFA to actually help New Zealand football keep the lights on. So the men's is really the only place where there's a viable source. And they're not the only national association in this situation. Again, I'm harping on it over and over, but like the Super League last year when it was put in place and they said, oh, the women will follow suit. Well, that would have given, 12 teams like a really financial backing in the women's game. But what about the rest of women who want to go up? I'd say a World Cup every 2 years does the same thing. If you don't have regular rotation of countries through that World Cup, if it's always the usual suspects, you're essentially giving 32 nations more power and abandoning the rest. What we have to do is make sure that every single area has a chance to develop. And you're not going to do that through World Cups. You're going to do that through making sure that confederations actually back their women's sides.
And Namrat has put something on. They don't even have a proper women's team. Reinforces the foundation, offering equal pay. Ireland's really struggling. Yes, what do you think of this about there's 168 teams for women, 200 for men, but apparently everyone's going to get a vote. But then, like you said, it's only the top 30 that really are going to be playing these games, if you look at it, in the women. But I think, will people just vote? What do you think? Do you think countries will just vote yes because it'll potentially mean more money for them?
With their two TAC groups, it seems like they aren't necessarily proposing the same thing for men and women, and they're exploring it, or they're making it seem like they're exploring it in different ways. So, and this is one of the really, I find frustrating parts about this conversation is that there's a lot of waves being made of we're going to change the international character, we're calendars plural, maybe have two proposals for men and women. We're going to put the World Cup every 2 years, but there's not enough detail coming out. So they're making a lot of waves with no details. And, like they love to say, oh, the UN is democratic. The UN is well, the UN is not democratic. And I would argue FIFA is not really democratic either. Like, I don't know.
I know what you mean.
Can we touch on a point that I find really that has been bothering me? Like one of the really big arguments when they have of making these international breaks, and they've largely touched on the men's one longer, is that they say, oh, it'll reduce the travel time. So because if you're based in Europe and you're having to go to the AFC or CONMEBOL or even CONCACAF, like that's every single month, that's a long trip. But what they never mention when they talk about this is, okay, it's great that you'll have to go to, let's say you're Australian, all the way to Australia less often. But once you get there, if your international break is a lot longer, you're not going to be in your country the entire time. Like you need to play against people. So arguably half the time you'll be traveling elsewhere. And some of these confederations are huge. So like I said, I cover Australian football, and the Socceroos are trying to qualify for the World Cup at the moment, and they've played Oman, Japan. They're going to play Saudi Arabia. They play China also in the next international break. That's a lot of traveling to be doing in a month if half of those games are away. I used to work in aviation, so did a lot of my family, and I was a pilot. And like, what kills you isn't that trip. It's the accumulation of long trips in a short period of time. So it's great to always be saying, because they keep harping up on this, oh, there'll be less travel. Yeah, there'll be less trips overall, but those will be condensed. And, let's go back to rugby union. The All Blacks had a really great documentary a couple of years ago where they kind of followed them through the Lions tour and then through their rugby championship. And when they got to the end of the rugby championship, where they go to South Africa and they go to Argentina, and I think they might have even had, I don't know, they also go to Australia. Like the guys were going, okay, yeah, we've had so much travel in the last month and a half. Like we just need 2 or 3 weeks to calm down. If you're doing that with international football over 3 or 4 weeks, you're going to create the same situation. So yes, it reduces the overall amount of travel, but you're just compacting it into Like, does this seem, am I the only one who looks at this and says, isn't this another area of player welfare that just isn't being discussed?
Yeah, I'd agree. It's like I said earlier, I don't think anyone, I said before, I don't think FIFA don't care for player welfare anymore. Look at how intense football is coming as a game. How intense the games are in terms of 90 minutes of football now is completely different to 90 minutes of football 20 years ago. You know, the pace of the game, how frequently they want games. So they're adding, especially in the men's, they're adding tournaments like every year. It seems there's another tournament coming out. They're changing more games. They want more games. They want a game every two. They're trying to. What happened with the Super League? That's not gone away. By the way, that will come back in a few years for sure. That's definitely not gone away. They were trying to move games all over the place. And I fear that the way football is going, and that's obviously from a women's perspective, I just feel like it's just going to get dragged with whatever the men's side want to do. That football is becoming like that. They want that kind of box office event all the time, where they want, let's say, Man United versus Bayern Munich in the middle of Africa somewhere. They want Man United versus Barcelona in halfway across Russia. They want these box office events in big cities. Now, I don't think they care about how the players feel about it, because for them it's money. The people that will win, if this goes through, the people that will win are media companies and FIFA. And it makes me laugh how UEFA are trying to make themselves, look good in this situation, going against it. UEFA is just as bad as FIFA. Let's get that right. So yeah, they don't care about the players. I said, I'm pretty sure if you ask most players, they don't want a World Cup every 2 years. They don't want all these tournaments they keep adding in, because why change something that's not broken? Everyone, looks forward to, let's say, the World Cup every 4 years, the Euros every 4 years, the Olympics every 4 years. If you start messing around with almost the foundations of football and the foundations and the heritage of these tournaments, it's just not right. I don't know why they're trying to fix something that's not broken. There's plenty of things in football that need fixing before this. That's for sure.
Money.
Yeah.
Our own Ella Toon said the other day in a press conference she doesn't agree with it. I don't think she's going to sort of bang a drum and stand up loud, but she was sort of like, we already play a lot of games, and she says she loves playing for England. She's just starting on her England journey, but even she's sort of like, listen, when
I think Demi Stokes also said like a month ago after the game that happened, Demi Stokes said, we're not robots, which is a really good way. Like, if you look at the women's international calendar at the moment, like, they went away to the Olympics and they came back. Next year, there's a Euro. The year after that, there'll be a World Cup, followed by another Olympics, followed by a Euro. Like, there's not going to be any break whatsoever for some of these players who qualify every single summer for a number of years. Sam Kerr made a good point that, again, you talk the women's game gets dragged by the men's, but like in the same direction of the men, and often women's concerns aren't discussed. And she made a great point when they rescheduled everything because of COVID, which was, when are we supposed to have children? Because this is a part that's rarely talked about in women's football, but women's fertility directly overlaps with their playing career. At some point, you might have to miss out to be able to have children. But if you have competitions every single year, you're essentially saying, okay, there's part of my career that I will not be able to have because I cannot schedule around it, if that makes any sense, which is what a number of players who've had kids in return have done in the past.
And there's more. There's kids that do it. There's kids. There's Sarah Bjorn. I know she came back, was with Leon, came back, and I think she even said, I don't know if she's just recently said, but that's not a good, there needs to be more. I mean, I think we saw at Man United with Siobhan Chamberlain, we changed we put, it's been written into the contracts now about maternity pay, but there's things like that aren't even considered at all for women. We're only just seeing it now slowly.
This is still an exception. Like, the first nation to do it was the US. But again, we talk about like the financial situations, like, which nations are in a financial situation where they give contracts to their national team players and where they give like assurances or programs to even come back? Like, Alex Morgan talked about when she came back from the birth of her daughter Charlie last year, it wasn't even, there really wasn't a program set up for her to come back from what is a natural thing that has happened to her, but that would seem obvious, being that this is going to happen at some point to some players' career, during some players' careers. But yeah, like there are aspects of the women's game that don't seem to be talked about, like Connor keeps saying, when they're just almost copy pasting from the men's.
Yeah. I just want to say before we wrap up, guys, and thank you for everyone who's watching. Hit like, share, subscribe, that kind of thing. You know what to do. One US women's national team player I've seen, and maybe there's more. I'm sure there's not just one. Becky Sauerbrunn, and I think she's the captain.
Sauerbrunn.
Sorry, Sauerbrunn, yeah. And I think she is the captain. I read, so it's just come out now, this quote, I've just been tagged in it. I read that one argument in favour is that FIFA wants to bring more youth into the game. If FIFA want to bring more youth into the game, they should do something to eradicate racism, misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia. That's her opinion on the biennial Women's World Cup. So that doesn't sound to me like she's for it. I think they have done this panel trying to look like they're gauging opinions from everyone, all different kind of players, all different kind of coaches. You know, I don't think, apart from Jill Ellis, maybe a bit of Alex Morgan, there isn't that many pros for me. I mean, listen, anyone can comment on this and say that there are, but I can't see.
I think one of their problems is they haven't actually given anything concrete. Like Molly Hudson just texted from the Times, just tweeted, like, Ellis wasn't sure whether there would be a separate vote for a biennial Women's World Cup in the proposals around the men's tournament. So they're proposing possibly having different structures or possibly making huge alterations to the game without even any details of if this is going to be a separate vote. Like, it seems like a lot of air being lifted with very little concrete plans having been put in place ahead, which
and that's what makes me think there's something more behind it with FIFA. We could talk all day about the corruption within FIFA, UEFA, and all these different corporations, but that's what makes me think there's more to it behind the scenes with FIFA, because this vote is 2 months away. Am I right? Is it December they're doing this, or they're meeting in December anyway? I think. And there's all kinds of people being invited to this meeting in December. Like, there's no way that this has come out now and that things are going to be starting moving in December, that there's not a plan yet. There definitely will be something hidden somewhere. And that's what I just don't trust these corporations like FIFA in the slightest. And it's like you just said there, the fact they don't even know if there's going to be a separate vote for women's and men's. You've got to look at them differently. They're run completely different at the moment. You can't have the same vote and just go, yeah, let's have it every 2 years for this two completely different sports at the moment, because they're just run completely different. It's just baffling to me.
Also baffling, like I'll harp on it again, like where we need to grow the game is at the confederation level. We need to make those, like even UEFA, the next Euro has one debutante, Northern Ireland. Like we need to make sure that more nations have a chance to participate. And we're just starting to enter an era where CONMEBOL, CONCACAF, the AFC, are actually increasing the amount of tournaments available to women to give chances for exposure. Like this might actually kill that chance and just reinforce the usual suspects, and in a way almost turn it into like rugby union, where you have a handful of teams that are really dominant, largely because it's a sport that's a lot less played, but they're dominant. They come back every year, and you look ahead of World Cups and go, realistically, who can win that? You know, that's what I'm afraid of, is that you're going to take any chance of actually having an evolution where the majority of nations have a chance of being competitive at the international level.
Yeah. Listen, we smashed it, I think. I hope. I want to say thank you to everyone who's watched. We'll watch later. Just put some comments in. Listen, that's what it's about. I think a lot of the comments have been agreeing with us. But listen, if you think, no, I love it, put it in. We'll come back. We'll check it. We'll discuss it again. You know, let's see. I just want to say thank you, Catherine. If you want to tell anyone how they can find you or what's coming up for you, let them know.
At Footy Paquette on Twitter, with my name spelled there. Yeah. And I write for Football, the women's game, and since 71.
Okay, brilliant. Connor, where can people find you? I can see your thing, but like, what's coming up for you? What's going on?
I mean, my at's there, but I was going to say, more importantly, follow this channel if you're not already. But I'm pretty sure if everyone's watching, you should be subscribed to this one. Obviously, we've got the men's account as well, all for United. Got some good stuff going on over there, and we do actually, just on that, we do want to see more women's fans across. The same way we want to try and get some more men's fans across watching the women's game. It works both ways as well, and we want to try and get some fans across there. So yeah, definitely go and check out that channel as well, and like the video as well. It's been a good show tonight.
Yeah, John, like the video, go back, watch it. It's been a good show. Like I said, I'm gonna go check out some football now myself, so that's why it's an early kickoff. I'm sorry. But yeah, hopefully 3 points for Man United tonight. And yeah, thank you everyone. Like, share, subscribe. See you soon.